release of Disney's live-action remake of The Little Mermaid, we now have 23 Disney live-action remakes that have ever come out from, of course, Walt Disney Studios. In today's ranking, I'm going to be ranking each and every one of them from worst to best. I'm very excited to be doing this ranking, but it was also really hard to get through some of these, so I did not rewatch all of these. Some of them are honestly very terrible, and some others are pretty surprising, but we're all going to have different opinions on this, so if you do feel different about how I feel on some of this, that all comes down to nostalgia, magic, and I definitely want to hear your guys' thoughts and your ranking down below in the comment section. Without further ado, as a heads up, I did put out a survey to ask you guys, should I include Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers in here? Some people think it's a sequel to the series, some people actually think it's a reboot, remake, and it should be included in this. You all voted yes on Twitter and YouTube, so it will be included in on here. If you don't feel like it should be, that's your opinion, leave it off your ranking. I don't care. Now, of course, let's get into this. Being at my number 23, starting off this list at the bottom is Pinocchio. This is hands down one of the worst remakes, and in general, one of the worst things I've seen from Disney in honestly a long time. The more I sat on this movie, the more frustrated and pissed off I got about it. And that doesn't come down to Tom Hanks' performance, which honestly kind of just feels haphazard, and it should have been honestly a ton better. And the visual effects for Pinocchio were cool. I actually like how they did take the look of all the characters and make them not look modernized or realistic. They look cartoony. That's exactly what I wanted from this movie. And sadly, while we got all that, this film turns into trash pretty quickly. They throw away a lot of the messaging and the themes of becoming a real boy and everything that kind of comes down to Pinocchio. And I'm a diehard Pinocchio fan. I love the original Pinocchio movie. This movie itself is not good, and honestly, again, the ending pissed me off. Like, the fact that he didn't even become a real boy, what the hell? I could go on and on and on talking about how bad I hate this movie, but it's not good, like, whatsoever, and if they wanted to make changes, they could have, but they should have done it in a better manner, because in my eyes, everything that's warranted throughout this movie is very lackluster and boring, and then by the time you get to the very ending, it just feels like it ends and they never actually get to the finale of what makes the story of Pinocchio so important. Now, my number 22 is 102 Dalmatians. Now, as a kid, I really liked this movie, but going back to rewatch it, it's not too great. Genuinely, I think the only good part about this film is Glenn Close as Cruella de Vil. She makes these movies for what they are, and in general, this just feels like one of those direct-to-home video films that everyone should just absolutely forget. Honestly, I forgot about it until I tried to rewatch it, and I was putting together this ranking, and I just sat there and I'm like, this isn't good, like, whatsoever. Now, my number 21 is Alice Through the Looking Glass. Now, this is the sequel to the Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland movie, and this movie, for me, I don't hate as much as other people, but I find it very boring. I find it very messy, and in general, in other terms, I'm a major fan of, like, the Alice in Wonderland world, and there's a lot of cool books that I think they could have spun off and did different adaptations of, and if you wanted to continue this world, you could have gone through there, and I found that Looking Glass just is very bogged down by exposition, boring dialogue, that all mixes in there, as well as adding in, it's just not fun. While I do think some of the vibrancy and the exciting, entertaining style that it does maybe make some of this film a little bit better for others that didn't love the darker tone of the first, I think a lot of that just comes down to also character choices as well. I think the biggest thing is that this film is just very forgettable. Now, my number 20 is the 1994 Jungle Book movie. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I've only seen this film once, and it was kind of cool how dark this movie was when I watched it as a kid. Trying to come back to it as older, though, it doesn't work too much for me. In a sense, is their first live-action remake. Some people won't include it, some people will. Overall, is a very strange adaptation of the original novel. And there's a lot of big changes, like there's no talking animals, and it's an adult Mowgli, and in general, it's an average movie with a decent idea that is just kind of very forgettable in my eyes. Number 19 is Maleficent, Mistress of Evil. Now, this movie in particular, it goes into such a wild idea because it's a sequel off the original, but doesn't really base off anything from the Sleeping Beauty movie, and it just kind of goes into its own epic adventure, which I can appreciate the difference that it wants to do in touching into Maleficent's backstory a little bit more. Sadly, though, I think the film is honestly just really stupid and weird, and anytime I've tried to go back and rewatch this, I just sit there and get bored. The only good element to this movie is literally Angelina Jolie as Maleficent. That's the saving grace of this film. My number 18 is Maleficent. Once again, the best aspect of this film is Angelina Jolie itself. I actually wish they would have framed this film, though, just in general for the Sleeping Beauty animated film and gone in that route instead of doing a backstory to the villain itself. Cinematography, the production design, again, the performance, all of that is very exquisite and fun, but it just takes away, and this isn't the Maleficent that I know and love. And while Angelina Jolie definitely touches in and hones into some of those things, this is again one of those films that I just roll my eyes at every single time, and I've never had the urge to go back and rewatch this one. At my number 17, this movie didn't piss me off, but it was very boring, and that is Dumbo. Tim Burton making a Dumbo movie you think would be brilliant on paper. And for some of this film, it is brilliant. I would actually say the first 20 minutes of this, I was really into it because it is the original Dumbo story. After that, though, they decide to kind of make a sequel out of this and where it needs to go, and that was not the idea that I wanted it to have here. While the visual effects on Dumbo looks cute, and Dumbo does look cute, and I'm a huge animal lover, this film is just very boring. It's very boring, and Tim Burton itself just does not have the style or structure that I want from this. Danny DeVito, though, and Colin Farrell, they're standouts. Number 16 now is The Lady and the Tramp Disney Plus live action remake, and this movie's cute for what it is. Talking animals, talking dogs, eating food, making kisses, and eating spaghetti with one another. That's exactly what this was. This was actually like the premiere Disney Plus film from what I remember, or maybe it was like really close to the opening of the Disney Plus coming out. But I found Lady and the Tramp to just be a cute dog story. Like, it reminds me of like when I watched Air Bud for the first time as a kid. I'm like, oh, cute puppy. That's about it. I'm sure kids absolutely enjoy this film a lot more than I do, but take that as what you will. Now, my number 15, this one might be a little bit controversial for a lot of you guys, and for me, it's not. This is one of the pure things that when I watched this remake, it literally made me think the entire way through. Why did they make this? Why is it made like this? And why am I not watching the original film? And then right when I got home from the press screening, I watched the original. That is The Lion King. I have friends who absolutely think this is the best live action reinterpretation of this. I also know a lot of people who think Jon Favreau's direction in here is great. There's no denying that the visual effects in here are absolutely stunning, that everything in here looks so hyper realistic. That is the biggest issue though. And that's the biggest issue for a lot of these Disney live action films that happen to have magical objects or animals that talk and aren't as expressive as they can be. And for me, I knew instantly that this film had lost me when I didn't cry when Mufasa had died. That entire sequence of Mufasa's death I thought was the dumbest thing and honestly was very laughable. And it sucks because I think the music structure and like what they do with Beyonce and Donald Glover in here and even like the Hakuna Matata song in here is wonderful. The sequences of music are great and I think are, not as great as the original, but are still good and enjoyable. It's the set pieces, it's the sequences, it's everything else in those nature that I wanted more from, and I just find this film to be lacking any of the magic from the original. Really hoping that the prequel that Barry Jenkins is making right now does elevate above this, but you're gonna have to sell me that these animals can be more expressive than anything else, because this just looked like watching a stuffed animal with like the voiceover above it. At number 14, this one is full nostalgia, and that is 101 Dalmatians. Again, Glenn Close makes this movie what it is. Her performance as Cruella de Vil is so great. I love seeing all the dogs. Whatever 102 Dalmatians did, that was awful. 101 Dalmatians does in such a fun and spectacular way. I don't fully love this movie, but it is one that when I go back and like watch clips of it or sequences, I'm like, yeah, that was a really good film from my childhood. But now at my number 13, this one's controversial because I think a lot of people hate this movie. My number 13 is Alice in Wonderland. For some reason, this film really jives with me. I really love what Tim Burton did with this one, with the creation of the world, and I think at the time of watching this film for the very first time, I have a little bit of nostalgia for, and mostly that is because I just got done reading like this whole new fantasy series on the Alice in Wonderland world, and it really reflected what Tim Burton had did. Really obsessed with what Tim Burton actually created for this world, and I know it's not a perfect movie, but for me, every time I go back to rewatch this one, I'm like, this is so dark, it's so weird, it's so freaky. It kind of feels like classic Tim Burton, even though the script is a bit of a mess. And number 12 is a film that I expected to love so much, but I actually walked away kind of disappointed from, but I still like the movie, and that is Christopher Robin, starring Ewan McGregor. It's an amazing job as a grown-up Christopher Robin who just lost sense of his childhood, and I really love, first off, the look of Piglet, Pooh, Tigger, and Eeyore, and how they actually brought those characters to life looking like stuffed animals, and I like how it kind of dives into, like, what if someone did lose their childhood? What if someone lost their imagination and kind of just lost themselves and needs that reminder of what it means to be a kid? And I think if we lose that sense of a child at heart in ourselves, you do lose some of that essence. And I think for me, Christopher Robin, while it is again not a perfect movie because it doesn't dive as deep into its themes as it needed to, it is a very surface level approach. It's one that I can enjoy, I can laugh, I can smile, I can get a little bit emotional because I do love Christopher Robin and I do love the Winnie the Pooh gang so much. In general, wanted this film to be a little bit longer and a little bit deeper. My number 11, this is one of the few live action remakes that is very different than its original, and that is Mulan. Now, Now, at the first sense of this, I know a lot of people might have this one actually a lot lower on their list. And I'm not gonna lie, when I first reviewed this movie, I'll take the hit. I thought this was the best live action remake. Then going back and rewatching the original Mulan and then actually comparing it to this, the original is 10 times better. No doubt about that. I think they lost the magic with not having the musical element, but I will say that I still love a lot of the action set pieces in this Mulan film. I still love what it needs to be said. I think it just in general loses its thematics of its main character and in general Mulan and how it loses those moments. I know there's a lot of other critics that have actually emphasized this a little bit more in their story. I just really was taken back by the production design, the cinematography, everything that centers around that. The film just, again, it loses its magic within the story and its characters. The film does take the broad strokes of the original movie and kind of hones it into its own. I think, again, there's just small little details with the character of Mulan that I wish they tinkered just a bit, specifically in her upbringing into this army. I also didn't really like the witch in here. I thought that was dumb. Mulan's chi power, again, taking away a lot of her essence of what makes her character so important. For me, this is still a good remake that I do enjoy quite a bit. It just doesn't hold up on further rewatch. At my number 10, this movie I have not rewatched recently. I know there's a lot of people who absolutely hated this movie. For me, at my number 10 is Peter Pan and Wendy. I love the Peter Pan story so much, and I do love the character of Wendy specifically, and the tones and the thematics that always go towards her character. Now, this movie is directed by David Lowery. I am a big fanboy for David Lowery. There is some biasness to that as well. Every film of his just feels very tailor-made for me. And Peter Pan and Wendy, for me, it kind of is disappointing that this was not in theaters, specifically because of how gorgeous the film looks. I did like the cinematography and the filter that, of course, David Lowery decided to frame this movie. Some of the film does feel a little bit cheap, and I kind of wish for a little bit more from the film itself. But for me, what I love about this is this kind of does what Dumbo does. The original story of Peter Pan is there, and it's really brilliant, and it's beautiful, and I think they captured the essence and magic of that. But in the back half of it, it is a brand new story that kind of dives into some of the further developments between Peter Pan and Captain Hook. And for me, that is where this film really takes place, in centering the soul and the heart of what is going on with Peter Pan, what is going on with Captain Hook, and their relationship itself. And I really thought David Lowery did a really good job with that. This movie's not for everyone. I know some people find this movie completely boring. It did entertain me, but it's not one of those remakes that I'm going to go back and rewatch all too often. I honestly thought this film was going to be pretty disappointing, but I thought it was still good. In some ways, I actually think it's great. On my number 9 is David Lowery's Pete's Dragon. Now, this is a completely different take on the original Pete's Dragon. The original Pete's Dragon is a classic film, but for me, has never really held up. It's not one of those ones that I grew up with all too often, but I love the character of Pete's Dragon. And what they were able to do with this film, I think Lowery really made a special, unique film that takes on that original concept, but doubles down and makes everything different, a little bit more thematic, kind of showing this personal story between one person and a dragon. And again, Pete's Dragon is one of those sweet films. I know, again, people that hate this movie because of all the changes they made, but I think this is one that is actually quite underrated. My number 8 is The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Yes, they did a live action remake to this, and it is an actually good movie. Now, I am not gonna lie, I have not watched this film in probably 10 years. I was going to rewatch it before this ranking, but I didn't get time. But from what I all feel, and the magic that I felt watching this film, Nicolas Cage absolutely kills it as the sorcerer in here. I actually really like Jay Baruchel in this movie, and it really much, you know, that musical scene with One Republic, that was great. It's just a fun movie that kind of takes on that same approach, but brings it into a modern day scenario. And I really miss the days where Disney and other studios would take, you know, this kind of idea and this kind of sense of blockbuster filmmaking and take it into that darker, grittier, little more angsty tone like we had in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, we had it in like the Transformers films, and we had it in the Pirates of the Caribbean films. I really like the sense of filmmaking here, and I don't think we get enough films like The Sorcerer's Apprentice. My number 7 is Beauty and the Beast. Now, watching this movie, I kind of do still get the same feeling that, yeah, I'd rather be rewatching the animated film, but it's hard for me to deny how beautiful and honestly poetic this film is compared to the original. It is a nice companion piece to that. Do I think it's anywhere close to it? Not at all. In fact, my fiance absolutely hates this movie, and her favorite Disney animated film of all time is Beauty and the Beast. Now, watching this movie, going back and checking it out, I'm still not sold on how the items and the magical things look like that, like Lumiere and Clockworth and everything of that nature. But I do think the magic is there when it comes down to the music, and specifically Gaston. Everything with Luke Evans' Gaston is the reason that this movie is so high up on this ranking. Gaston sweeps in and steals this entire film, and I think, in my eyes, this version of Gaston is better than the animated features film. And I love what they did with Luke Evans' character in here. While it's not as more deep than the original, this character's never really been that deep, he is so much fun, and he embodies everything about this and absolutely brings the charm and spirit that you would want into a live-action version of that character. I think everyone overall does a pretty damn good job in here, and this is as close to as great as you're going to get within this. I think there's just, again, you lose a lot from the set pieces, but I think there's an argument to be made that the sequence when Be Our Guest actually looks pretty cartoony and fun, and not as bland as another film that we're going to talk about, which I did like more than this. My number 6 now is Cinderella. Now for me, I again have not revisited this one too often. Biggest reason being, I'm not the biggest fan of the animated feature, and I'm not the biggest fan of just in general the Cinderella story. But I will say that this film is actually better than the original Cinderella animated film. I think what Kenneth Branagh did here was he brought those sweet sensibilities that you want from the Cinderella story and doubles down and makes it even stronger than before. I think there's no denying that Lily James is Cinderella. The way she embodies this character and brings her to life is just beautiful. Kenneth Branagh, for me, out of all these movies, I think he is the true visionary for this and developing and creating a sense of wonder. And it's so beautifully done in the way that we see Cinderella that it actually does feel like an enchanting story. Honestly, shout out to Richard Madden as well, who very much recharacterized the entire prince in here. A lot of beauty in this film, a lot of magic as well, that I think a lot of these remakes just honestly lose. I honestly think there's an argument to be made that this might be Kenneth Branagh's best film yet. It's crazy to say because that guy has had some incredible films. Number 5 is Aladdin, and this one I was so skeptical going into. I rolled my eyes at the trailers. I hated the fact that Guy Ritchie was directing this, even though I love Guy Ritchie. I hated how Will Smith looked like in this. I like the casting, of course, Aladdin and Princess Jasmine, but everything going into this movie just made me roll my eyes. And this was actually one of the most rewatched films for me that year. Not in theaters, but once it came on home, I watched that film quite a bit. A lot of that is because I actually do like the way that Guy Ritchie adapted a lot of the set pieces. While, again, making this film look realistic to some manners, he created set pieces that fit the original and is a nice subsequent viewing piece to that original film, which is so perfect. And then casting Will Smith, who's arguably one of the most charismatic stars in Hollywood, you know, for me, Robin Williams at the time was that star. And how do you do that? You have to adapt the Genie into a different style, and I think Will Smith did about as perfect as a job as anyone could be, because recasting Robin Williams is almost impossible, and they did a damn good job with it. All the musical sequences in here are great. The only reason this film is lower on the list is sadly because it is way too damn long, and, well, the villain sucks. Honest with you, it's nothing against the guy's performance, but the way they wrote this character of Jafar was sadly just unimpressible, and I honestly think the original version of this is 10 times better. For me, Jafar is one of the best Disney villains of all time. Number 4 now, though, is the brand new The Little Mermaid movie, which I went into very skeptical. There's no doubt about that. I sat there and I was like, everything just looks so stiff, and then coming off Wakanda Forever, and then specifically Avatar, everything just looks fake. And I hated how Flounder and Sebastian were going to look. I was like, really? You couldn't go any other route? And thankfully, I ate my own words up. Now, the first 15 minutes of this movie is a bit rough. I do think it is pretty weak, and it doesn't really get the magic going until you actually get into Ariel's life. And once Halle Bailey sings a part of your world, that's when I knew, all right, yep, this film's good. The magic's still there. And the film itself, while I think the animated feature is still better, the film itself still does what it needs to. It has those classic moments, but it also doubles down and does a little bit of different elements, specifically when it comes down to the third act, and a lot of the stuff that kind of comes above the sea. Everything out of the water, I actually think is better than everything under the sea, which is not what Sebastian wants you to think. In the animated feature, I found that everything above the water, besides the Kiss the Girl sequence, was boring, and everything under the sea was so magical and splendid. The fact that I can watch this film and go, wow, they actually improved Prince Eric and Ariel's relationship to where I actually care about them both. I actually love the performance from both of them. Halle Bailey, though, is perfect as Ariel. I will die on a hill saying that. I think she is so good in here. Talent, acting, music. I mean, the fact that a majority of this film, she is mute. She does not talk. The way that she portrayed that curiosity that Ariel has was all there. and it was beautiful to say the least. Melissa McCarthy was actually a big standout as Ursula. Did not expect that. I thought she did a great job. Wish they didn't change a couple lines in Poor Unfortunate Souls and some of the other moments, but those are like nitpicks. The only issues I have with this film is, again, too long. Some of the new songs are not great. And in general, the stiffness in the water looks a little bit fake with how the mermaids swim. But besides that, this is a film that next generation of kids who this is their way of viewing The Little Mermaid for the first time, they're going to like this more than the cartoons. I don't get why, but that's how these remakes are made. They're made for the younger audience. My number 3, though, is Jon Favreau's The Jungle Book. What he did in here is exactly what the guy wanted to do with The Lion King, and it just did not work out. Somehow the animals are a lot more expressive in here. I think the casting of the actor who plays Mowgli in here is wonderful, and the creation of everything. This was like the first film that actually made me go as far as say, okay, you can do a live action interpretation of The Jungle Book and these scenarios. And I think for me, every single one of the voice casts in here are so important, whether it's Bill Murray, Ben Kingsley, Idris Elba, Scarlett Johansson, Christopher Walken, Lupita Nyong'o. The whole cast goes on and on from there, but I'm obsessed with this movie. I love the interpretation of it, and I like the way that they weave the music into here. I'm nostalgic to the original Jungle Book, but part of me sometimes actually thinks that this one is better than the original, and that actually kills me to say, but I think they're on par with one another, specifically because of the differences, great magic that original one holds compared to this one. My number 2 is Cruella. Cruella is another one that I rolled my eyes at the fact that they were doing another thing of this. The only two things that actually had me excited for this was Emma Stone and the director of I, Tonya was going to be directing this, and man, did I eat my words. If it wasn't for my number 1, this would be my favorite, but since you guys wanted me to include my number 1, I did, but we'll talk about that in a second. Cruella for me is downright just an awesome movie. I love the way that they kind of built up this character and her origin story, and in a way how this is kind of a nice companion piece to the Glenn Close Cruella de Vil film 101 Dalmatians. And I think for me, seeing that how Emma Stone is in here and how she portrays Cruella and seeing her upbringing is some of the most fascinating parts of it. It's kind of like a gangster film, but in the same vein, it's from Cruella de Vil's perspective, and it's a heist movie at parts, and in general, the I, Tonya director, Craig Gillespie, does an amazing job editing this film in such a fire rapid pace that I could not get enough of Cruella's film here. I also really love the production design, and specifically the costume design is something to be really enamored with. In general, out of all these live action remakes, I think there's an argument to be made that this is the most stylistic, extravagant, and honestly downright best made film out of all of them. Charm, it's got flair, it's got fun, and that's exactly what I wanted from a Cruella film. I'm surprised we're still getting a sequel. I don't know how that's gonna work, but even if it doesn't happen, I'm so happy that we got this film. At my number 1, you guys said to include it, and that is Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. I grew up with the original, and now having this live action interpretation, which is a reboot, a remake, a sequel, a parody on all that, it works. And I was so shocked by how damn right good this movie was, and I shouldn't have been, because it's directed by Akiva Schaffer, who did a film like Popstar, which is again one of the most underrated comedies of the last few years. It exceeds all expectations by taking on a Roger Rabbit approach and bringing it into the real world. Hilarious, it's funny, and I really love the way that they actually took the likes of Chip and Dale and how one looks the original animation and one looks the 3D animation, and the jokes and puns that they kind of play throughout this entire film on that. Andy Samberg works in here, John Mulaney works, both of their chemistry working off one another is great, and I love how they brought up, and again, all the different Easter eggs, all the different scenarios, ugly Sonic itself. This is a film that knows exactly what he needs to be, and it's easily one of the most entertaining remakes or live action stuff that Disney has done in a while. Not a lot of people will include this in their ranking, just specifically because some people viewed this as a sequel, but for me, I think it's viewed as a reboot, a retooling, a remake, and in general, also a sequel, and at times, that's where you gotta include this on here. It's not the most deepest of all films, but it is just a highly entertaining one, and as someone who loves the characters of Chip and Dale, and specifically the Rescue Rangers show back in the day, this was every single thing that I ever wanted it to be and more, and God, I hope we get a sequel to this. I don't know if we ever will, but we absolutely deserve one. My ranking of all the Disney live action remakes from worst to best. Maybe I forgot some, maybe I didn't. You'll let me know down below. Thank you so much again for watching this, and of course, until next time, stay classy.